and look straight ahead. You see that lamppost? That's how long it is and that's how wide it is. And the Texan said, do you know how big my ranch is back home? If I got into the car at 6 o'clock in the morning and drove and drove and drove, several hours later, I still wouldn't have reached the end of my ranch. The Punjabi says, I know exactly what you mean. I used to have a car just like that. We can brag about how big things are, how long it is. And here's God taking them through this terrain. Imagine in that rugged terrain, with such a vast number, how annoying it must have become after some time to put up with all of the grumbling and all of the complaining. 40 years. Here's the first lesson I want to leave with you. The shortest route is not always the best route, because it can bypass some of life's most important lessons. The shortest route is not always the best route, because oftentimes it can bypass life's most important lessons. And he says, I took you through all of this wandering. Why? So that you would get to know what was in your heart. One of God's great designs in your life and mine is for us to look at our own hearts and understand who we really are on the inside. Not what people think we are. Not how it looks with the plasticity on the outside and all the makeup that we can have. Many years ago, in the year 2000, the former Soviet Union was releasing its political prisoners. And one of them was a Hungarian prisoner by the name of András Tamas. He had been incarcerated in the Soviet Union in 1945 when he was 20 years old, and was released in the year 2000 when he was 75 years old. A lot of that time spent in solitary confinement. They basically almost devastated this man psychologically. When the prisons were being, it's a true story, when the prisons were being emptied, they were going to do away with this man because he was talking total gibberish. They thought he was a psychiatric basket case. And somebody else said, don't do that. Why don't you bring a Hungarian psychiatrist and let him at least talk to this man and see if there is some hope. And so the psychiatrist spent a protracted period of time with András Tamas, came out and said, the man is not talking gibberish. This is an old Hungarian dialect. Give him to us. We will work with him. We will reshape his mind. We will get him back into society. And so the Soviets granted that. And so they put him in a wheelchair, and the psychiatrist was wheeling him out. If you have never read the story, you will never guess what his first request was. As he's being wheeled out, he looks at the psychiatrist and says, can I have a mirror? I haven't seen my face in 55 years. Now you figure out, you're a strong, determined young man at the age of 20, and the next time you see your face, you're 75. Politics, ideologies, does these things to people. And he could only last a glimpse for no more than a second or two. When he held up that mirror, he burst into uncontrollable sobs and put the mirror face down. He couldn't, for the life of him, believe that this was the same man they'd picked up when he was 20. We get up every morning, put on our innocent forms of disfigurement, look at the mirror, we like what we see, and then we go out. Let me ask you this. Is there a mirror for the soul? Is there a reflection God intends for you and me so that we know what we are intended to look like? It was George MacDonald from whom C.S. Lewis borrowed this statement, you do not have a soul. You are a soul. You have a body. You do not have a soul. You are a soul. You have a body. Is there a mirror for the soul? Here's the first lesson. I took you through that wilderness for all these years so that you could see in the humility of your own heart what you really are like. Humility. God alone knows how to humble us without humiliating us and to exalt us without flattering us. God alone knows how to humble us without humiliating us and how to exalt us without flattering us. So said the famed Australian and New Zealand writer E.M. Blakelock many, many decades ago. It's a statement I remember reading in one of his tiny little books and writing it down. And here's the first lesson. God intends you and me to have a humble heart and a humble spirit. Do away with pride. Do away with arrogance. The difference between David and Saul was that David was a man of a humble heart. Saul was an arrogant man who always wanted to look good and powerful in front of the people. Humility. There are two ways to learn humility. Number one is this, to focus on the person of Jesus Christ. The Bible says in Philippians chapter 2, who being in the form of God thought it not robbery to be equal with God, talking about Jesus, but made himself of no reputation and humbled himself, being found in fashion as a man, he became obedient unto death, even the death of the cross. Wherefore God also has exalted him and given to him a name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee shall bow and every tongue shall confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father, who being in the form of God thought it not robbery to be equal with God, but made himself of no reputation and took upon himself the form of a servant. If the very Son of God can go all the way down to the humiliation of the cross, showing us that he was a humble servant and walked with the ordinary, talked with the needy, found himself with the destitute and the poor and the widow and the fatherless, for whom he placed such value in life. So often he found himself with a common person, and the Bible says the common person heard him gladly. It was the power brokers that were really fighting him. Humility. You learn this emulating capacity by observing our very Lord and how he lived, how he walked, how he died. God also finally exalted him, gave him a name above every name. That's the best way. It's a tough way. I've seen people like that in my walk. I've seen the humble of heart, and every time I've been with people like that, I have walked away just overwhelmed by it all. Just this week, I think, if it was not here, we came here from Indianapolis, I think it would have been somewhere there. Somebody was talking to me about a man that I knew in Calcutta. His name was Mark Buntain. I have some special friends and colleagues from India here tonight as well. They all know who Mark Buntain was. He was known as Saint Mark of Calcutta. Thousands were fed by his congregation every day. One of the humblest human beings you could ever meet. When I was 19, preaching my first 2 or 3 sermons, he was sitting on the platform in his church and gave me the pulpit to preach. I was a nervous wreck standing in front of that people and preaching. It was the second or third time I'd ever stood in front of an audience. And I'll never forget, as I sat down and my whole body literally trembling, I was glad it was over with. This saint of a man reached out and grabbed my hand and he said, "That was anointed." Anyone who knows Mark Buntain, if you're in the audience, you'll know I have not exaggerated what I have just said to you. An extraordinary human being. And the hallmark of Mark Buntain, his humble heart, his humility. And I call upon you, whoever you are, no matter how successful, God wants you to humble yourself. And when you watch the person of Christ, that humility naturally comes. If you don't come to it that way, I'll tell you, he'll get you there one way or the other. And here's a terrifying statement from Thomas Aquinas. The first time I read this, I didn't like it. I'm not even sure I agreed with it. But the more I've read it, it is chillingly true. Listen to what he says. In order to overcome pride, God punishes certain people by allowing them to fall into sins of the flesh, which though they may actually be less grievous than pride, are outwardly more shameful. From this indeed the gravity of pride is made manifest. For just as a wise physician, in order to cure a worse disease, allows the patient to contract one that is less dangerous, so also the sin of pride is shown to be more grievous by the very fact that as a remedy, God allows men to fall into some other sins. Wow. Do you know what Aquinas is saying? If you don't deal with pride, He'll know how to bring you to that point of dealing with it. That which in culture may be atrocious, though in the eyes of God is actually less grievous than the sin of pride itself. He'll bring you to recognize the grievousness of pride by allowing you to fall into something lesser, where culturally you'll be seen for what your heart and my heart really is. You see this happen time and time again. I think that's why Billy Graham prays a prayer every morning. I heard him say this. Every morning I pray, Lord, please today let me not do that which has taken you, do that which will destroy, that which has taken decades to build. Let me not do today to destroy that which has taken decades to build. Humility of heart and the humbleness of heart. One of my great heroes as a young theological student was John Wesley. I don't know how many of you have read John Wesley's life. He was not a gigantic personality. He's fully stretched. He was 5'4". So not exactly a towering presence to walk up in front of an audience. Wesley traveled 250,000 miles by horseback preaching. He preached 40,000 sermons in his life. Compute that. When the famous Oswald J. Smith in Canada was celebrating his 80th year, Billy Graham came to Toronto to preach and talked about the fact that O.J. Smith had preached 12,000 sermons in his life. That's 12,000 in the day of television and radio. John Wesley, 40,000 in the day of horseback, the original version of the Sermon on the Mount. Mount his horse, go and speak. Mount his horse, go and speak. 40,000 sermons, 250,000 miles, worked with 15 different languages, wrote 600 pieces of literature, some of them massive journals. At the age of 83, he was angry with his doctor because his doctor didn't let him preach more than 14 times a week. At the age of 86, in his journal, he writes, laziness is slowly creeping in. There's an increasing tendency to stay in bed after 5:30 in the morning. Now, I've consoled myself by saying he probably went to sleep at 4 in the afternoon. I don't know what time he went to bed. He was one of 19 children raised by Susanna Wesley. Susanna herself was one of 29. I don't know. I wouldn't want that. I wouldn't want to buy their shoes. 19, 29. One day, Susanna looked at John and said this to him. When he said, Mother, how do you define sin? She said, Son, whatever weakens your reasoning, impairs the tenderness of your conscience, obscures your sense of God, or takes away your relish for spiritual things. In short, if anything increases the authority and the power of the flesh over the spirit, that to you, John Wesley, becomes sin, however good it is in itself. So he covers the two great continents, brings in this great evangelical awakening. You go to his home in London. There's a monument at the back there, a tribute to him. And these who took a lantern and went out with that shout, I'm looking for God, I'm looking for God. Nobody says it as well as he himself did. So let me read a few paragraphs for you. Have you not heard of that madman who lit a lantern in the bright morning hours, ran to the marketplace, and cried incessantly, I'm looking for God, I'm looking for God. As many of those who did not believe in God were standing together there, he excited considerable laughter. Have you lost him then, said one. Did he lose his way like a child, said another. Or is he hiding? Is he afraid of us? Has he gone on a voyage or emigrated? Thus they shouted and laughed him to scorn. But the madman sprang into their midst and pierced them with his glances. Where is God gone? He cried. I'll tell you, we have killed him, you and I. We're all his murderers. But how did we do this? How were we able to drink up the sea, Who gave us so big a sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What did we do when we unchained this earth from its sun? Whither is it moving now? Whither are we moving now? Away from all suns, maybe? Are we not perpetually falling backwards, forwards, sidewards, in all directions? Is there any up or down left? Are we not straying through an infinite nothing? Do we not feel the breath of empty space? Has it not suddenly become colder? Is not more and more night coming on us all the time? Must not lanterns be now lit in the morning hours? Do we not hear anything yet of the noise of the grave diggers who are burying God? Do we not smell anything yet of God's decomposition? God's decomposed too, you know, and He's dead. He remains dead, and we have killed Him. Now, how shall we, the murderer of all murderers, compose ourselves? Because that which was the holiest and mightiest of all that the world has ever possessed has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood from us? With what water can we purify ourselves? What festivals of atonement? What sacred games will we need to invent? Is not this the greatest of deeds, too great for us? Must not now we ourselves have to become God, simply to seem worthy of this? You know, there has never been a greater deed, and whoever is born after us because of this deed shall be part of a higher history than all history hitherto. Here the madman fell silent, and again regarded his listeners. They too were silent, and they stared at him in astonishment. At last he threw his lantern to the ground, and it broke and went out. I come too early, maybe. My time has not yet come. It has been related further that on the same day this madman entered diverse churches, and there sang a requiem, Aeternam Deo. Led out and quieted, he is said to have retorted each time, what are these churches now, if they are not the tombs and sepulchres of a dead God? God is dead, we have killed him. Nietzsche, every line that he spoke had a backdrop and had a foreground into which he was looking. One of those comments that may just slip by you and me is this: maybe my time has not yet come, he said. And he went on to say how everything that dawns in an ideational form takes a little while before it takes root, and then you begin to see its flower and its blossom. And he said it will happen sooner or later. It happened in Europe much more quickly. In fact, it might interest you to know that Adolf Hitler was a devout student of Nietzsche, and he personally presented Nietzsche's writings both to Stalin and Mussolini. Joseph Stalin was once upon a time a seminary student preparing to go into the ministry. And there came a time in his own student days where he decided he was no longer going to withstand the implications of believing in God, and renounced his faith. In fact, he then is credited with having killed over 15 million of his own people. The last gesture that Joseph Stalin did, which I shared with some of the generals of the Lenin Military Academy, and they were silent as I shared it with them, it is this. Malcolm Muggeridge says that Svetlana Stalin, Stalin's daughter, personally told him over a talk over the BBC that the last thing my father did as he was hallucinating is sit up in bed one last time and clench his fist toward the heavens once more, threw his head back on the pillow, and he was gone. There was a stridency to his anti-theistic state of mind. And I remember after I finished a lecture at that Lenin Military Academy, as the generals lined up to shake hands with me, and I talked to them on the implications of a godless universe, the lead faculty member grabbed me by the hand, and he said this. He said, Dr. Zacharias, I believe what you have said is probably right, but it's very difficult to change after 70 years of believing a lie. Now, you and I living in the United States, it was much longer for this idea to take hold. And somewhere in the 60s, that idea began to take root. And as we look back upon the last 4 decades, I want to take you through 3 moods that came upon particularly the North American subcontinent here. And as those moods took hold, the ideas of a godless culture began to take stronger and stronger hold on you and on I. You see, whether we like it or not, please hear me carefully, religion is the essence of culture, and culture is the dress of religion. What you and I believe about the ultimate purpose and meaning of life works itself out into culture. And if religion is at the heart and core of culture, and culture becomes the dress of religion, then what happened in the previous 4 decades is very important for us to understand. 3 ideas began to take root. 3 moods began to take hold. And as I present them, I want you to take a look at this definition of culture and then look at these moods that ended up ultimately decimating the absolute. Daniel Yankelevich, a sociologist, says this: culture is an effort to provide a coherent set of answers to the existential situations that confront all human beings in the passage of their lives. It is an effort to provide a coherent set of answers to the existential questions that confront all human beings in the passage of their lives. Now, interestingly enough, if you were to go into India today and ask them what defines your culture, there will be a predominant answer of the Hindu pantheistic worldview. If you were to go into many parts of the Middle East, the predominant answer would be an Islamic worldview. If you go into Thailand, the answer would be it is the Buddhist worldview. If you were to come to the United States, I think you'll get as many different answers as the individual to whom you would talk, and possibly the undergirding idea would be we are principally a secular society. So I want to talk a little bit about this notion of secularization, because I think it is a double-edged sword. It has valuable help in the kind of culture in which we live, but then that very blade ends up stabbing us when we are looking for some absolute answers to life's most challenging existential questions. The first, therefore, is this idea of secularization, a mood that has taken hold for the last 30 to 40 years. Let me define it. Secularization is the process by which religious ideas, institutions, and interpretations have lost their social significance. May I repeat that? Secularization is a process by which religious ideas, institutions, and interpretations have lost their social significance. I can illustrate that for you in the following way. I recall when I was living in Toronto, Canada for about 10 years. Toronto for nearly a century has been described as Toronto the Good. It got that brand in the 1880s when the mayor decided to make it a city with high moral impetus. But as the years were going by and struggles came and moral issues confronted culture, there was a significant moral question before the electorate in the 1980s. And the man who was running, who was the incumbent at that time, was challenged to deal with this issue in a way that would not take the Canadian ethos down the wrong road. It had to do with certain matters of personal practice and so on. And he went on the air, and this is exactly what he said. I have received thousands of telephone calls on this subject, but I'm going to disregard all of them because a vast majority of those calls have come from religiously minded people, and we know that they do not deal with these issues objectively. Fascinating comment, that we know they do not deal with these issues objectively. So a person's view was dismissed on the basis of the fact that he or she were a religiously minded individual. When you examine the foundations of a comment like that, put it in your own thinking in the following way. Suppose a volatile issue were being discussed in our society of a moral nature, and you had on the panel a professor, a lawyer, a university president, you had a medical doctor, you had a politician, and you also had a minister discussing the same issue. Who do you think would be assumed to have the least amount of academic authority on the subject? Those watching would immediately certainly assume that the university president and the professor had an idea, the lawyer would know the implications of society. Deep inside, most skeptics would say the religious person is the only one that comes here with prejudice. The rest of them are going to deal with this very, very rationally. But as you examine this struggle, my dear friend, and you look upon this country now and what's happened in the last 30 to 40 years, my suggestion to you is this: while we are cognizant of a very serious war raging thousands of miles away, a war that threatens your and my lifestyle and the values we cherish. There is a more insidious war going on right in the home front. And the insidious war is this: to what source are we going to look for objective moral authority and value? What is going to define us as a people? Now that I have spent half of my life in the West, having spent the first half of my life in the East, I see troubling signs in North America, wondering whether we can withstand what is going on inside of us. When I was at a hearing in Washington, D.C. some time ago, the issue was on terrorism. Sitting next to me was the writer Peggy Noonan, and many congressional people were around that table. And Peggy Noonan stood up and said, "Is there anything that terrorists fear about America?" There was pin-drop silence across that table, and I stood up and said, "Can I take a stab at an answer?" I would want to suggest to you that what the terrorists fear most probably is a morally strong America. That is probably what they fear the most, because they know the cohesiveness of a moral conviction cannot be dislodged very easily. And if you examine what secularization has done, the problem with secularization is as it sweeps over a culture and takes root of that culture, you begin to lose definitions in the process. How do we define right from wrong? How we define moral from something that is immoral? I recall when I first moved to Atlanta, Georgia, a leading pornographic entrepreneur was being tried for all of the stuff that he was peddling, and they were trying to select a jury. It took them many, many days to select the jury, because one of the first questions the defense lawyer was asking them is, "Are you a member of a local church?" And in the South, it was very difficult to find somebody who answered in the negative. They all were members of the local church, and therefore they were being put aside. And the lawyer's point was this. He said, for me to bring religiously minded people here is they will already have a predisposition towards pornography, and I'm looking for people who are neutral towards it. Basically, some kind of moral zombie who had no idea on what to believe in this matter, or possibly never even heard the word. This masquerades as sophisticated thinking and judicial astuteness. When you're looking for someone who has absolutely no opinion on something that can so overtake the imagination and cause havoc in young minds. And this is the way he went about his questioning. When a witness came to testify against his client, he looked the witness and eyeballed the witness, and he said, "I have some questions for you. Have you ever been into an art gallery?" "Yes." "Have you ever paid to go into an art gallery?" "Yes." "Have you ever paid to go into an art gallery where there are paintings by the great masters of art?" "Yes." "Have you ever paid to go into an art gallery where there are paintings by the great masters of disrobed and unclothed people also on display there?" "Yeah, I suppose so." "Will you please tell this jury why you call that art and why you call my client's products pornography?" How do you answer in yes and no things like that? And I began to think, if that man sat across the table from me and I had to reason with him, what would I say? How would I find a point of reference on which he and I would agree to a logical deduction from that? And I thought of the biography of Michelangelo. When he started painting disrobed, unclad people, his teacher one day called him and said, "What are you doing this for?" And Michelangelo said, "Because I want to see man as God sees man." And his teacher said, "I just want to remind you, you're not God." It was an interesting response. But of course, it doesn't solve the issue to put it that way, does it? So let me take you to a parable given by C.S. Lewis that gets to the nerve of this problem. C.S. Lewis has a book called A Pilgrim's Regress, in which he talks of his own conversion from atheism through pantheism and even dabbling in Marxism, till finally he secured his own life as a follower of Jesus Christ. And C.S. Lewis, in this book, A Pilgrim's Regress, gives it in an allegorical form. His straight prose narrative is called Surprised by Joy, but in this allegorical form, he refers to himself as John, meandering through all of these worldviews looking for answers. And he said, my problem was I was not getting answers anywhere. And then I wandered into this mountain he calls. The mountain was the spirit of the age. And he pictures himself enjoying the precepts of the spirit of the age. But he said, I always felt myself bound in chains. A fascinating description of living for every whim that he had. Bound in chains. He said, I sat under the stare of the head of the spirit of the age with his neuronic gaze just staring at me. He said, as I sat there day after day, the waiter representing the spirit of the age would bring me my meals. And one day, as he unchained me so I could enjoy my breakfast, I made the foolish comment, I should have thought of it, when I looked at him and said, this milk is utterly delicious and refreshing. And the man representing the spirit of the age said, you only call it milk as delicious and refreshing. All it is the secretion of a cow. Like it's urine or anything else. You just call this one name and the other things are called other names. He said, then I made the bigger blunder on commenting on the eggs. He said, and you should have heard the parallel he drew for the eggs. I won't even insult your intelligence by repeating it for you. Pick up the book. And he said, as I looked at that and heard that in revulsion, I wanted to respond, but I didn't know how. We were calling it one thing, they were calling it another thing. He said, then all of a sudden reason came riding on a horse and rescued me. And as reason came riding on a horse and rescued me, he looked at the head of the spirit of the age and he said to him, you lie. You lie. You don't know the difference between what nature has meant for nourishment and what nature has meant for refuse or garbage. That's the point I want to make for you. You see, when an artist takes a canvas and paying ink or whatever and somehow convinces himself or herself that there's some artistic genius here, there may be some justification. If the artist has any sense of perversion in the mind, the canvas cannot look at the artist and say, do not do this to me. But a person sitting in front of the lens of the camera, whose disrobing is purely for the titillation of the fanciful imagination of somebody who's never going to be satisfied by it, but might end up taking him or her down the road of ultimately imaginative destruction. The person sitting in front of the lens of that camera ought to scream out and say, don't do this to me. But she will not say that, or he will not say that, because when secularization has done its work, it would lead to a generation that has lost its sense of shame. Think about that. I met a young Iraqi officer who sat across the table from my wife and I, and he said this to us. I was in the Iraqi army, trained to do two things: to make false passports, and number two, to kill without any emotion and any feelings. Think of being a human being who can do that without any feelings. This was a young man who was growing up under a demagogue whose pure training compiled false documents and murder without any sense of emotion, without any sense of feeling. Ladies and gentlemen, to you and me it may seem like a small thing when we look at a generation without shame. But you show me a human being without a sense of shame, and I will show you a human being who will stop at nothing. And secularization literally comes from the word Latin saeculum, this worldly. There is no transcendent moral order. So we see, number one, secularization leads to no shame. Secondly, quickly, pluralization, where there's a competing number of worldviews available to its members and no one worldview is dominant. A competing number of worldviews available to its members and no one worldview is dominant. If you really want to see pluralization in a classic way expressed culinarily, walk through Los Angeles. where you can see a Korean's wagon selling kosher tacos in a fast food outlet. Pluralization in culinary expression. Pluralization is a good thing. We must be able to allow contrary views to exist and take them into the marketplace. But if pluralization ends up being relativism, then once again, you are on a course to destruction and error. See, it's not what is Eastern and what is Western. It is what best reflects reality. And to those of you in engineering who think in a linear way, you know very well you don't fudge with the numbers. It'll get you. There is an exclusionary fact to reality. And the problem today, young men and women, is this: in this terrific age in which you are, find the moral point of reference for your absolutes. There are some things in life you'll find out are either or. You either fall in line by it, or you will bear the consequences. What is an absolute? Have you ever been at a traffic light and your mind is wandering? You've stopped and all of a sudden something next to you is moving and you don't know if that car is moving or you're moving? What's the first thing you do? Go for the brake. After you go for the brake, if you're still not sure whether you're moving or the other person's moving, what do? You look outside at a tree or a building which is stationary to measure your movement by that which doesn't move. What would happen if the trees and the buildings started moving too? That's what's happened in society today. Like the man in Leicester, England, who used to work at a clockmaker store, going to work every day, adjust his watch by a clock outside. One day the clockmaker stopped and said, "I find it fascinating. You adjust your watch every day." He said, "Yes, sir. My watch doesn't work very well. I'm the timekeeper at the factory. I have to ring the bell at 4 o'clock every afternoon and my watch doesn't work very well." The clockmaker says, "I've got some bad news for you. My clock doesn't work very well either. I adjust it by the bell that I hear from the factory every afternoon at 4 o'clock. How do you find an absolute in a relativistic age? I'll make this one comment. I've gone beyond my time, but that's not uncommon for an Easterner. It is this: relativism cannot be true. Cannot. Because when a person makes the statement that all truth is relative, he or she either includes that statement or excludes it. If that statement is included, that all truth is relative, that means that statement is also only relative and not always true. If it excludes the statement, then it is positing an absolute while denying that absolutes actually exist. Relativism simply cannot be true. So when the postmodernist says words do not have any meaning, you have a right to ask him what he meant by that statement. I say to you, secularization leads to no shame, pluralization kills reason, and finally privatization, where we are forced to take our belief into the private world. And there's a bifurcation, a breakdown between who I am in public and who I am in private. And in that bifurcation, there is a loss of meaning. I was fascinated by one politician's statement recently that he did not allow his faith to interfere with his politics. Shocking. Then does the politics interfere with the faith? Or are they two never meeting parallel tracks? Is it a faith that is true or fictional? We try to separate this, and the single greatest sign of our times is a loss of meaning. Wasn't it Jack Higgins, the writer, who said the one thing he now knows that he wished he'd known as a younger man, that when you get to the top, there's nothing there. Ours is a troubled world, very troubled. I crisscross this globe so much my heart aches. I've laid in my bed at night and wept with what I've seen going on out there. God has given you a unique privilege of being in this land, which was founded on a Judeo-Christian worldview. Islam and pantheism would never have framed a nation like the United States of America. Know what you believe, why you believe it, and know that ultimately transcendent worth is the ultimate worth to every man, woman, and child. No, it is not just this world. It is God we look to. That was all over the place. You'd hear it all over the globe, but there's always somebody who hasn't heard it. And it's the story of Sherlock Holmes with Watson camping out one night. And after a lot of liquid refreshment, the darkness of the night in their tent, Holmes looks up and he looks into the night sky and he looks at Watson and he says, "Watson, what do you see?" And he says, "I see stars and stars and more stars." He said, "What does that tell you?" He said, "Well, astronomically, it tells me that there are millions of galaxies and potentially billions of planets. Astrologically, it tells me that Saturn is in Leo. Orologically, it tells me that it's about 2:45 in the morning. Meteorologically, it tells me that tomorrow will probably be a great day. And theologically, it tells me that God is an all-sovereign and a great God, and we're just a minute part of the great whole." "Why, Holmes, what does it tell you?" He said, "Watson, you idiot, somebody has stolen our tent." Have you ever thought what the very word university means? It comes from the joining together of unity in diversity, which was the greatest pursuit of the Greek philosophers, to find the ability or the skin or the tent that would pull it all together. And yet here we are now, most of us graduating from pluriversities, with the disciplines sort of running along their own little tracks and not finding out how to connect these disciplines one with the other. When you see this kind of thing, you realize how difficult communication might become. You may have heard the story of this Indian farmer who was talking to a Texan. And the Texan was bragging about his ranch, and so he looks at the Indian farmer and he says, "Mr. Singh, how big is your farm?" And the Indian farmer says, "You know, if you look a little out of the distance, you see that lamppost there?" He says, "Yeah." So my farm is that long and about that wide. That's about the length and breadth of my farm in Punjab. He says, "Why, what about yours?" He said, "You know something, in Texas," he said, if I were to get into my car in my ranch at sunrise and keep driving and driving and driving, by about 9 or 10, I still would not have reached the end of my property line." And the Indian farmer looked at him and said, "I know exactly how you feel. I used to have a car just like that." You take all of the disciplines running along their different tracks, try to bring common ground in communication, and it's all right if you're just talking about the dimensions of your farm. But if you're dealing with the very foundational questions of life's essential purpose, then all of a sudden the differences come. Some things are sacralized, some things are desacralized, and these conflicts arise in cultures that are willfully pluralistic. I was in Jerusalem, Israel, not long ago, and 4 young Palestinian men, friends of mine, invited me out for an afternoon to have some tea in one of the restaurants. I arrived there, and one of them looked at me and he said, "Ravi, can I tell you a little story?" He said, "A famous Bible speaker by the name of Brother Andrew was here some time ago. And I was sitting at a table with Brother Andrew and a leading mullah, leading sheikh. And they were very cordially talking to each other. And he said, it was a tense time here. He said the Israelis in some activity had killed about 4 Palestinians. And at the instruction of this particular sheikh, 8 Israelis were ordered killed, and that was carried out. So he said, I'm sitting here at a very tense time with an even more tense conversation. For one of them was involved in this act. And he said, I watched as Brother Andrew and he spoke. And Brother Andrew leaned forward and said to him, Sheikh, can I ask you a question? Who made you the judge of this world, or the executioner to this world? Who made you the executioner to this world? The Sheikh looked rather surprised and he said, I am not the executioner. I am merely an instrument of God's justice. At which point Brother Andrew paused and then looked at him and said, what then is the place for forgiveness? And the sheikh didn't bat an eyelid. He looked at him and said, that's only for those who deserve it. That's only for those who deserve it. And this young Palestinian lad looked at me and he said, in that 2-minute conversation, I realized how difficult it was to find a bridge between worldviews. In that 2-minute conversation, I found out how difficult it is. And ladies and gentlemen, even though we may say it lightheartedly and so on, I know there are issues today where one wrong word could completely destroy your future. One misspoken analogy can be taken the wrong way. And so I'm walking through a minefield here, trying to make sure that what I communicate to you, and I'm more of an extemporaneous speaker, and I don't really go to a manuscript to talk, so I hope you'll give me the benefit of the doubt if some word seems errantly spoken to you, and if that happens, I'll be happy to clarify it during the question and answer time. But in our cultural struggles globally, we are dealing with issues of huge dimensions. And the fact that a university setting like this can be a venue to afford a discussion of this nature is a tribute to all of you. And so I want to thank you as a campus, thank you for the organizers, and thank you for those who put in all of the hard work so that even if we disagree, we don't need to be disagreeable. My mother used to say when I was a young lad, once you've cut off a person's nose, there's no point giving them a rose to smell. And so I don't want to cut off any roses and then offer you cut off any noses and then give you a rose to smell. We hope we'll get the terminology right there. In the 1980s, sociologists like Daniel Yankelevich were writing about the cultural shift in dramatic ways. And in one of the leading publications, he was quoting Daniel Bell, the social thinker, and here's the way he defined culture. Culture is the effort to provide a coherent set of answers to the existential questions that confront all human beings in the passages of their lives. Okay? So culture is an effort to find not a disparate set of answers, but a coherent set of answers to the existential questions that confront all of us in the passage of our lives. Then he went on to say this, seeing where we were headed, a genuine cultural revolution then is one that makes a decisive break with the shared meanings of the past, particularly those that relate to the deepest questions of the purpose and the nature of human life. So a cultural revolution is underway when we are making a decisive break from the shared meanings of the past, particularly those deep questions that deal with the very purpose and nature of what human life is all about. So if it's an effort to find a coherent set of answers, and a cultural revolution takes place when we are taking a decisive break from the shared meanings of the past, then you know the more you get to the hard questions, if you calibrate them wrongly at ground level, to use an airplane analogy, if the calibration is wrong at the ground level, then the higher the altitude you fly to, the variance is going to be wider and wider and wider. And it's these culturally shared meanings that are now up for grabs, and the cultural revolution is now into its second or third generation. What was happening? I believe there were three sociological phenomena that was lying beneath the surface. I use this only as a scaffolding now to bring you to the point of what it is I think the deductions really are and wherein lie our answers. Many years ago, one of them wrote it in these words: first, dentistry was painless, then bicycles were chainless, and carriages were horseless, and many laws enforceless. Next, cookery was fireless, telegraphy was wireless, cigars were nicotineless, and coffee caffeineless. Soon oranges were seedless, the putting green was weedless, the proper diet fatless. New motor roads are dustless, the latest steel is rustless, our tennis courts are sodless, our new religion godless. All of a sudden, definitions are taking place without a transcendent perspective of any kind. And the three underlying sociological phenomena were as follows. Number one, the process of secularization. What is the process of secularization? It is the process by which religious ideas, institutions, and interpretations were deemed to have lost their social significance. Where religious ideas, institutions, and interpretations were considered to have lost their social significance. Yes, they could function, but in terms of the hard questions of meaning, essence, and destiny, they were put on the margin and not considered as serious voices in the shifting sands of the Cultural Revolution. How do we even illustrate something like that? Say you were discussing a serious social issue of our time, and you had a panel in front of you on television, and you're watching the program. And you see an academic, you see a psychologist, you see a lawyer, you see a medical practitioner, you see a philosopher of ethics, and you're listening to all that they have to say. You see a behavioral scientist and so on. And then all of a sudden you come to a pastor and his or her view on the subject. The way the sociological fabric was changing, at the moment the religiously ordained person started to speak on the subject, he or she was assumed at that point to be prejudiced on the subject, as if all the others were completely objective on what they were dealing with. That's precisely what secularization actually meant. That religious ideas, institutions, and interpretations were losing their social significance. When you saw this kind of thing taking place, you began to see what it was that people were actually arguing for or arguing against. The secularization process was described well by British journalist Steve Turner. We believe in Marx, Freud, and Darwin. We believe everything is okay as long as you don't hurt anyone to the best of your definition of hurt and to the best of your definition of knowledge. We believe in sex before, during, and after marriage. We believe in the therapy of sin. We believe that adultery is fun. We believe that taboos are taboo. We believe that everything was getting better despite evidence to the contrary. The evidence had to be investigated, and you could prove anything with evidence. We believe there is something in horoscopes, UFOs, and bent spoons. Jesus was a good man, just like Buddha, Muhammad, and ourselves. He was a good moral teacher, although we think his good morals were basically bad. We believe that all religions are basically the same. At least the ones that we read were. They all believe in love and goodness. They only differed on matters of creation, sin, heaven, hell, God, and salvation. We believe that after death comes the nothing, because when you ask the dead what happens, they say nothing. If death is not the end and the dead have lied, then it's compulsory heaven for all, excepting perhaps Hitler, Stalin, and Genghis Khan. We believe in Masters and Johnson. What's selected is average, what's average is normal, what normal is good. We believe in total disarmament. We believe there are direct links between warfare and bloodshed. Americans should beat their guns into tractors, and the Russians would be sure to follow. We believe that man is essentially good. It's only his behavior that lets him down. This is the fault of society. Society is the fault of conditions. Conditions are the fault of society. We believe that each man must find the truth that is right for him, and reality will adapt accordingly. The universe will readjust, history will alter. We believe that there is no absolute truth except the truth that there is no absolute truth. We believe in the rejection of creeds and the flowering of individual thought. And then he put this stinging postscript. If chance be the father of all flesh, disaster is his rainbow in the sky. And when you hear state of emergency, sniper kills 10, youths go looting, bomb blasts school, it's but the sound of man worshiping his maker. If chance be the father of all flesh, disaster is his rainbow in the sky. And when you hear state of emergency, sniper kills 10, troops on rampage, youths go looting, bomb blast school, it's but the sound of man worshiping his maker. Now, I want to funnel this thought down to show to you what exactly the uppercase secularization process actually ends up doing. Now, again, you'll have a chance to respond to it or have it clarified or even counter it in the question that you raise. But here's what happens. When secularization has moved into the marketplace of ideas, where anything from a transcendent basis is evicted by virtue of the fact that it invokes some transcendent perspective, what ultimately happens? What ultimately happens? Where do we turn to for our definitions that are not ultimately self-referencing? This was proven many years ago when a leading pornographic purveyor, whose pornography was considered to be so vile that the man arguing against it said, look, it actually makes Playboy magazine and all look pretty tame, and we wouldn't even be here discussing that genre. We're talking about something heavily perverted here in the abuse and use of children and women and so on in ways that are totally dehumanizing and degrading. But the man who was arguing for the defense of this man's right to produce it had a very clever way in a secularized consciousness to shape his questions. And here's what he said to a witness who was witnessing against it. And he said to him, have you ever gone into an art gallery? And the man says, yes. Have you ever gone into an art gallery where there are paintings by the great masters? Yes. Have you ever gone in there where you see paintings of the great masters of unclothed people? Yes. Have you paid to go into such an art gallery? Yeah. Will you please explain to this jury why you called that art and why you call my client's stuff pornography? And he had many of them on the ropes, and in that kind of a setting, of course, you're not going to discuss the philosophy of art versus the philosophy of porn and so on. But as I would read the transcript of those and try to come to terms with it in my own mind, I thought to myself, you know what? This is not a new question for art vis-a-vis pornography. If you read the biography of Michelangelo, even the first time he started to paint disrobed people, he was put to the question by his teacher, who raised a very important question so that he would understand what his responsibility would be. He said, Michael, why are you doing this? Michelangelo said, because I want to see man as God sees man. And the teacher looked at him and said, but you're not God. And then the unfolding dialogue is fascinating to try and understand the difference of parameters and boundaries and, more importantly, purpose. But it reminded me of C.S. Lewis's book, in A Pilgrim's Regress, in which this is an extraordinary conversation. It's a fascinating book, and the reason Lewis portrayed it as a pilgrim's regress rather than his own progressive journey to Christ in his book called Surprised by Joy, he took this in an allegorical form in A Pilgrim's Regress. And the reason he calls it a regress is because on his journey through atheism and pantheism and all of the philosophies that his brilliant mind was wrestling with, and he was faced with why he was turning away from them, he couldn't quite put his finger to the nerve or what it was he was rejecting and why he was rejecting it, but he knew there was something systemically flawed in the worldviews that he was rejecting, until he came to know Jesus Christ. In his testimony said, Surprised by Joy. And this brilliant Oxford scholar tells the story. Then he took a regressive journey, for he had more explanatory power to why he had rejected some and why he had trusted this particular one. And now in this allegorical journey, he is in the mountain called the Spirit of the Age, where everything goes. But fascinatingly, allegorically, Lewis, who refers to himself as John, pictures himself as handcuffed by the Spirit of the Age. Not free, but bound. A brilliant metaphor of how absolute freedom can actually become a form of bondage in itself. And while he's bound in chains, he's looking at the neuronic stare of he who heads up the spirit of the age. And while he's talking to him, the waiter comes and serves him his breakfast, unbinds him. And young John takes a drink of milk and says, "This is very refreshing." And the man representing the spirit of the age says, "It is it? What do you call it?" He said, "Milk." He said, "It's only the secretion of a cow, isn't it?" He said, "A cow secretes urine, produces milk. What's the difference? Just the secretion of a cow." Young John says he didn't know how to respond to this. And then he made a big mistake on commenting on the tastiness of the eggs. And the waiter says, "You know what an egg is, don't you?" And he proceeds to give it the most debased description. And young John doesn't know how to respond to it. But he says, all of a sudden, after that man has gone, reason comes riding on a horse and rescues me and says to me, looks at the weight of the spirit of the age, and he says, "You lie. You lie because you don't know the difference between what nature is meant for nourishment and what nature is meant for garbage. You don't know the difference between what nature is meant for nourishment and what nature is meant for refuse." Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to think that an average person standing in front of the lens of a camera, whose unclad body is being used by marketers of sensations to trap young minds and lock into their memory banks ideas that will haunt them the rest of their lives and put at risk not only their hungers, but possibly the very sacredness of their vows and their marriages and so on. I would like to think that somebody who's being paid to do this would stop at a point and say, "Please don't do this to me. Don't do this to me." But you know what happens when secularization has its full run at things like this? It will ultimately cease to have the ability to define distinctives and could ultimately produce a generation without a sense of shame. When the mass murderer Bundy was standing before the judge, he was asked if he felt any guilt. Do you know what he said? "No. I feel sorry for anybody who felt guilt. I feel sorry for them." From what I hear, things happened along his journey before he was finally cast into prison and so on. I feel sorry for anyone who has any sense of guilt. And the judge looked at him and said, "How did a man as brilliant as you make such a catastrophic mess of your conscience? How did a man as brilliant as you make such a catastrophic mess of your conscience?" Do you know, from what I understand, psychiatrists are dealing with the possibility of a medication that can counter post-traumatic stress disorders. Those who come from the battlefield and unable to sleep because of all of the trauma and so on. But the fear in the discussion committees is this: if we are able to find a drug that is so able to erase the memory of horrific things, to what end will that drug be put? To a rapist or a mass murderer who the morning after a series of crimes can just swallow the pill and not feel any sense of guilt whatsoever. This was precisely the path Hitler went on. Outside the gas chamber of Auschwitz are his words: "I want to raise a generation of young people devoid of a conscience, imperious, relentless, and cruel." One young man in Malaysia had lunch with my wife and me. He had escaped from Iraq. He worked for the army of Saddam Hussein there. He looked me in the eye when I asked him what he did in the peak of his military career. This young muscle-bound guy looked at me and said, "I was taught to kill without feelings." And what I want to say to you is definitions are crucial in the earliest stages of sensitivity. And if secularization moves to the point of taking any transcendent notion out of discussion, and if religious ideas, institutions, interpretations, which the founding documents of this nation actually attributed the very sacredness of our rights to having been endowed by the Creator, what will that make of a society that has lost its sense of shame? That's why a philosopher of ethics says, ours is an age where ethics has become obsolete. It's superseded by science, deleted by psychology, dismissed as emotive by philosophy. It is drowned in compassion, evaporates into aesthetics, and retreats before relativism. The usual moral distinctions between good and bad are simply drowned in a maudlin emotion in which we feel more sympathy for the murderer than for the murdered, for the adulterer than for the betrayed, and in which we have actually begun to believe the real guilty party, the one who somehow caused it all, is the victim and not the perpetrator of the crime. The entire reversal, the entire